The media today, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a mess. You've got the combination of newspapers that didn't see their inevitable disintermediation. You've got the rush to social media and to influencers and content creation, which is still struggling with some of the very basic concepts of how you communicate with audiences, how you make money out of communicating with audiences. You've got huge changes in societal behaviors and expectations. Long-form content versus TikTok, the attention span of the average 16 to 18-year-old. All of these things are causing huge challenges and have been for the last 10, 15 years. A lot of it we saw emerging back in 2007, 2008. I think it's a time of great confusion and a time of great scatter. I think there are huge opportunities out there for the right people, but it's really piecing it together. What I thought would happen, like the dominance of platforms like Facebook, that hasn't really happened in the way I thought it would originally, because we're seeing Meta really emerging as the only player standing now. Musk has completely killed Twitter. The problem you've got is the environment right now, it's clicks makes the money, and what makes clicks? And a glorious mess makes clicks. And a nuanced 1,200-word piece about a teacher in Iraq is not going to get you the clicks.
Alexander McNabb, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
I don't normally do this, but I want to do it with you because I think you're a special case. You came here to the UAE in the 1990s?
Yes.
So I want to know how, I came in 2003, I thought that was early. You're way before that. So how is it that a British boy decided to make the trek before anybody else to the UAE?
I don't know if it was before anybody else. There were legions before me. But I first came here in 1988. I traveled to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia in 86. And that was the most extraordinary experience. I mean, Riyadh in 1986 really was Klondike country. It was unbuilt. The roads weren't finished. They used to put oil drums full of sand in the unfinished roads just to stop you hurting yourself by coming off the road. And I got here in 1988 to attend GTEX, the technology trade show, which was then, I think, in its second year. It was called JEET. And I was on the Dubai-Sharjah highway. Sorry, us English people call it a road. And the traffic was backed up a little bit. Nowhere near like it gets these days, but it was backed up a little bit. And these blokes in their four-wheel drives were driving off the road onto the sand. And I was a child of punk. And this just appealed to me so overwhelmingly. You know, a country where people just drive off the road. I mean, in England, you clearly wouldn't do that. And so it was a love affair from that moment onwards almost. And by about 90, so I worked for a publishing company, which was a startup based in all places of Hitchin in Hertfordshire. And over time, it became obvious that we needed some sort of presence here. And I ended up establishing a partly owned subsidiary called Arabian Publishing, based in Ajman. So I literally moved out to Ajman to start a publishing company. So,
sorry, when you say you needed a presence here, why?
Well, because it was very difficult. I remember I used to spend a lot of time talking to a chap called Nick Cardy at Etisalat, and Nick was a big old English bloke, and he would say, Alexander, you've really got to come here and have a presence here. You can't go on writing about the Middle East from London. So there was always that in the back of our minds. The Gulf War was a bit of a hiccup and stopped it. And then the idea of opening up that subsidiary, which was what sort of our first toe into the water. And then, so I moved here to do that and published a magazine called Computer Bio Middle East because I was in IT-based publishing. And that was it. I found myself in the Emirates and never looked back since. Haven't been bored for a day.
So were you based in Ajman?
Yeah.
Based in Ajman in the 90s?
Based in Ajman in the 90s. I can't remember how many issues we were in. It was a reviews magazine. And in those days, that was quite a funky thing to be, a computer reviews magazine. And I remember some bloke sent in his computer and it didn't work. And so I reviewed it. I said, this computer's rubbish and it doesn't work. And of course, turns out he was related to somebody and the office was shut within the day and all sorts of problems on the back of that. So, I mean, these more regulated and ordered days we're living in now do have some things to go for them. The anarchy was all very nice, but having your office shut because you wrote something bad about a computer was a bit of a awakener.
So, and this is something that I want to touch upon. Maybe we do it now, which is You and I both have worked in media here, and we know some of the issues that we faced. What would you think is maybe the most interesting story that you can tell us about some of the challenges that you would have faced? Because I know that I've faced stuff, but some of that's recent, some of that's in the last 20 years, but you would have faced issues before that.
I don't know that I really have faced that many challenges. I think people are always, in my experience, people have often been, expats have been overcautious. The self-censorship, and yes, people here can be very sensitive, but I've found very few situations I've ever been in where humour and a sense of being willing to negotiate and arbitrate around something have sorted you out. I think the biggest ever trouble I ever got into was a friend of mine and I were in Sharjah taking photographs of cars in the puddles after the rain, and the puddles were huge. So it was all very fun, and we had our little cameras. And this chap came out of the mosque in a grey Sharjah police uniform and promptly collared us for taking photographs of ladies. And so they took us down to the cop shop, and we were there, and we were in terrible trouble. And our friend was going to write us up and all sorts. And his friends were sort of ribbing him and going, "Aren't you going a little bit far here, mate?" And eventually I said to the friends, look, I'll sort this out, okay? Here's the deal. He develops my film. If there's one lady in it, you put us in prison. And if there are no ladies, he pays for it. And that was everyone decided that was the ideal solution. And our friend was very upset with us, but everyone was laughing and saying, yep, that's a good scheme. So I think if you're witty, a little bit of wit gets you a long way here sometimes.
And I think a compromise, a nicely placed apology.
And there's a phrase I used, I have to confess, a number of times in my career, even the finest horse will take one stumble. And that will get you a nod and, okay, that's very wise. And the only thing about it is you can only ever use it once.
Well, use it once with the same person.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
But because I've discovered that sometimes they want to put maybe a face to the name. So they want a face-to-face meeting. And maybe there is an issue, maybe there isn't, that about something that was published. But they want to sort of be able to look at you and have a conversation, drink a little bit of coffee or tea with you, get to know you. And then if you're able to apologize, if you're able to have kind of a frank conversation where maybe there's a little humility on your side, I've found that goes a long way.
And I think, it's not, people often treat it as if it's a local thing, and I don't think it is. I can't remember having been, apart from that one incident over the computer review, in great trouble with a local. The one time I was threatened with being horsewhipped was a South African gentleman, which is when you know as a journalist you've certainly made your mark.
Yes. So when you have these conversations with different authority figures throughout your time, do you look back and you say those will one day make a nice chapter or two in a subsequent book?
Oh, I don't think so. People keep telling me I need to write my memoirs, but I can't see that anybody would be interested at all in my memoirs. They need to buy the history book first.
So I completely understand with that, what you're saying. I feel the same way. But I also think that when you do end up having a couple of conversations with friends, do you ever go back at the end of the day and say, actually, there are some pretty good anecdotes there? And something that might make for... So my thinking is I might have a chapter or two, but I don't know that I have a book in me. And this is something else I wanted to talk to you about, and we might as well talk about it now. I've never written a book, I've never even tried to write one, but I've heard many other people, some famous authors, some not so famous, talk about that love-hate relationship they have, because I think the longest piece I've ever had published is maybe a 2,000-word feature. And that was laborious. I think I'm a decent writer, but I don't think I'm a fast writer. So for you, when it comes to writing a book, this Children of the Seven Sands is massive. Do you get halfway through it and you think, what have I done?
See, there's a couple of things going on there. The first one is, I don't know if you've ever read Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. No. Fantastic book. And there's a scene in that where a lecturer is lecturing his class and he says, I want you to write me a 50,000 word or 10,000 word piece about the front of the town hall. And they all break themselves against this task and they can't do it. How can we write 10,000 words about the front of a town hall? And he said, well, start on the top left-hand brick. And so all you got to do is break it down. A book is 30 chapters. What's in a chapter? If you're writing fiction, you've got your narrative arc to play about with. But at the end of the day, you're just telling a long story, and you need to break it down and do 1,000 words a day is a reasonable. When I first heard 1,000 words a day, I thought that was underdoing it, but it's probably about right.
1,000 publishable words, I guess.
1,000 reasonable words which you can knock into shape afterwards at the editing stage. And I mean, The Children of the Seven Sands was more difficult because of the amount of research that's involved, because it is non-fiction. But I don't think writing a book is terribly difficult. When I first started, I had a terrible case of what they call the Dunning-Kruger syndrome. Dunning-Kruger is when you think you can climb mountains because you've never done it and you're a complete idiot. And once you've actually climbed a mountain, the next time you're filled with self-fear and doubt and guilt and everything else that you can be filled with. Same thing for writing books. When I wrote my first book, it was like, I'm going to dash down 100,000 words, send it to London, they're going to love me, and I'm going to place an order for my Gulfcraft yacht. And yeah, you get halfway through and you think, oh my God, this is all rubbish. And like I think A Decent Bomber was my fourth full-length serious novel. And that was written about a man who was in the IRA and who was brought back from retirement by some modern terrorists to make bombs for them. Because I was very annoyed about the fact that they're making you take your shoes off at the airports in case there's a bomb in the heel. And the IRA's last bomb on the British mainland weighed a metric ton and blew out the heart of Manchester. It was literally a lorry, and did £5 billion worth of damage. So how are we treating this modern terrorism with such great fear? So, and in that book, I was about 30% of the way into it, and I realised the protagonist, the main guy in the book, he was a cartoon character. It just wasn't working. I felt like I was writing Mickey Mouse. And my sister-in-law arranged for me to meet somebody who'd been in Long Kesh, what they call the H blocks. He'd served 15 years of a 22-year sentence as a member of the IRA. So I got to meet him, and he scared the pants off me. I mean, he was a really scary chap. But I walked away from that meeting going, oh, okay, now I've got it. And I finished the book. So I think as long as you've got an idea that's a decent idea, I think there's a great truth. Everyone's got a book in them.
So do you think, though, that you will find that moment for yourself where at some point, because, and I say this not trying to butter you up, but because you've been here so long, and I know that you've written, I think this is your 6th book, correct?
It's my first published non-fiction. This would be my 7th.
Okay, so your 7th. So you've done it before, but nothing about the media scene, say, in the UAE, PR, traditional legacy media. You could also embark upon that, no doubt.
Yes, but it would be scandalous.
So that's the book, though, that the publishers and I would want.
Yeah, but I remember doing a session at the Literature Festival once, and there was this chap in the front row of the audience, a very attractive man, very well turned out, very, very handsome, rather louche. And he was sat through my session nodding to himself and smiling. And afterwards he came up to me and he said, I've written a book. How do you think I should publish it? I said, lovely, you've written a book. And I've written a book you quite quickly learn is a little bit like I've got an atom bomb in a corned beef tin. You know, it's often a problematic introduction. But okay, you've written a book. Super. What's it about? He said, well, I'm a Dubai party butler. And it's my memoir of all the excesses. And I was like, no, go away, get out of this room. I don't want to know. I don't want to. And he sent me his book, and it was, I think, probably the most scandalous thing I've ever read in my life.
Did it ever get published?
I don't think it did.
Yes, and is he still alive?
I think he probably is somewhere being very happy not being a Dubai party butler, but it must have been quite wearing for the poor dear.
Yes, I would imagine it would be.
Yeah.
So, Children of the Seven Sands is a book about the history of the UAE. Mm. For this one, I'm curious how long, because you and I were talking before we started this episode, you said that there was so much research that was involved, going into various university archives and whatnot. How long did it take you to write this one?
I suppose it took about a year to pull it together. There must have been I honestly don't remember. But I mean, it all sort of goes back to about 1994 when I was driving through the mountains one day and found a grave. And back in 1994, you couldn't Google things. You had to do
Old
things
school
like send
research.
people faxes. Yeah. And I found out that it was a Wadi Souk burial that had been dug by the Swiss Liechtenstein Archaeological Association. So I interviewed them. I found them in Switzerland. They were rather surprised to be found. And I interviewed them, and I wrote a piece in a magazine I ran at the time called Gulfwide. And the piece was called Death in the Mountains, and it was drawing a parallel between the fact that this 5,000-year-old, no, I'm lying to you, 4,000-year-old grave had been a burial site for multiple burials, but also was dying a second death in the mountains now because it had been excavated and it was just left open to the elements. And I remember they covered it soon afterwards, and I thought maybe that was because of my wonderful journalism, and I think it's probably not. But since then, I've been interested in the fact that wherever you go in this country, if you stumble on a rock, it's got a story to tell. There are forts, there are old walls, there are old palaces, houses, grave sites. The place is littered in history, and you constantly find people say, oh, there's no depth, there's no history, there's no culture to the Emirates, or, oh, it just goes back to 1971. And it doesn't. It goes back to the very dawn of time. It goes back to the dawn of humanity. The Arabian Gulf used to be a fertile valley. That was the Garden of Eden.
So several episodes ago, I had an Emirati urban planner on, and we discussed many things. One of the key elements for me, the first 11 years I was here, I lived in Al Ain. And Al Ain is going through a transformation at the moment where they're getting rid of all the roundabouts. And so we ended up talking a little bit about the history of out in Al Ain and why the country, and this I guess would be a question to you now that you're maybe not an expert, but I think very close to it because of this book and the research that you would have done. Why do you think that there isn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe the premise of my question is wrong, but I get the sense that there isn't enough effort put in by the government to preserve either the old school roundabouts from 50 years ago or the really old school forts that might have existed hundreds of years ago.
It's got better. Some of the forts, like if you go to the Fahidi Cultural District in Dubai, that was in a crumbling ruin. Fujairah Fort was crumbling apart. So I think it has got better. I think it could yet get better. I think there's an enormous commercial and touristic opportunity that we're not exploiting in turning some of these places, or many of these places, into visitor centres. Like the Malaha Archaeological Centre is a fabulous little place, and it's the only one of its type in the country. So bigger, better museums, visitor centres, open them at the weekends, stop closing museums and destinations at the weekends, and really do celebrate the history that's here, because it's an amazing history.
And that's one of the things that, Saudi Arabia's talked about for their 2030 vision. What they want is to make sure that tourism is a big part of it. And they've been appealing to UNESCO to get various sites sort of listed as a World Heritage Site. And I don't know that the UAE does enough of that to promote it, because I get the sense that there is a small group within the Emirati community that does value the history. I don't know that there's enough of the younger generation that value that. I think that's changed or is changing. And you see, what happened here, I mean, the recent history of here was debilitating poverty. The 19th, 20th centuries, thalassemia, diabetes, plague, cholera, smallpox. The people of Dubai were so poor they'd eat locusts. So when you find oil, or in Dubai's case, you find commerce, and then that's accelerated by oil. When you're building a modern nation state and your people are wealthy, it's very hard for them to look upon that horrible past and say, oh, let's go back to that, let's celebrate that. The other problem you've got here is the Brits. We unilaterally abrogated our treaty relations with the Emirates in 1968. A bloke called Goronwy Roberts just jumped off an airplane. I always have this lovely idea of him in a pinstripe suit with a bowler hat and the Financial Times under his arm. I think some of those people are still coming in today.
Yes. Well, Goronwy Roberts just arrived and told the rulers of the Emirates that the Brits were pulling out. And the rulers of the Emirates were, also the rulers of the trucial states at the time, were aghast. Like, how can you just do this? We're depending on you for our defence relations, for our foreign relations. If you can see the enormous impact of Brexit and how the UK struggled to get their act together over 2 years. Imagine from the ground upwards establishing a modern nation state in a very aggressive region of the world for absolutely nothing. And so what had to happen was the founding fathers of the Emirates had to come together. And it doesn't matter how much oil money you've got. It really doesn't matter. You've got to build everything, all of the trappings of state. There wasn't a currency. Dubai used the Qatari Dubai Rial, the Qatari Dubai Dirham. They also used the Indian Rial. Abu Dhabi used the Bahraini Dinar. There wasn't a cohesive postal system. There wasn't a cohesive communications network. There wasn't a road network. There was no Ministry of Finance, no Ministry of Health, no Ministry of Education. In fact, no Ministry of nothing. And so they had to stitch all of this together from a standing start with an undeveloped state, because the Brits had done nothing to develop any infrastructure. And so there's this whole relentless future focus. Everything's about the future. Everything's about building institutions. Now, into the next 50 years, it's about building people, because you realize that it's great having all the institutions built, but it's the people that need to be built as well. So that relentless focus on the future, on development, on building a state, has meant that nobody's really focusing on, oh, let's celebrate the past. It was a particularly miserable and poverty-stricken past. Let's get the future sorted out. And I think you've now got to about the stage where you can say, do you know what? Here's a global nation. We've achieved the big stuff. Maybe it's time you can go back now and celebrate a little bit more of who we are and where we come from, particularly when you're 10%, 15% of the population of this global country. And so I think that's a process we're now starting to see. We're starting to see young Emiratis more interested in answering the question, who are we? Where do we come from?
You know, you've explained it better in the last 3 minutes than anyone else in the 22 years I've been here. And I think it's because, and I don't want to get either one of us into trouble, but you're willing to mention some of the sensitive areas for Emiratis, right? Where you and I come from a places where if you have put out a story and it's 50% positive, 25% indifferent, and 25% negative, we think that's a success. Whereas in this world, you know, PR has to be 100% positive or it's not good. But you've explained it so nicely because it does make perfect sense. Why would we want to look back when it was so difficult for so long? And we need to sort of build everything that we do. And I think that the UAE has done a fantastic job building up institutions. But then the next phase, of course, is, as you said nicely, you know, which is to build up the people. I think that's very, you know, and that's, you know, Abu Dhabi wanting to build that knowledge-based economy is essential to get where they want to get.
And it's also a natural process because the focus was into the 1990s, the early noughties. It was all about university places, hospital places. Nobody was worrying about the quality of the faculty or the quality of healthcare. It's about the numbers. You know, you've got to achieve your numbers because we want to have these development statistics to show that we're doing a good job. I think now you can afford to relax a little bit and to say, you know, the basic infrastructure is in place. The human infrastructure now is what the focus is. And I think that human infrastructure is also more interested in discussing what are we as Emirati, what does that mean? And there's a tremendous pride in there as well. And one thing I think that we haven't done well so far with the history, which I hope this book helps to be a small catalyst for the change, is to say, do you know, there's an awful lot in here. There's an awful lot to be proud of. There's a heritage you have. There's a history to your families and to your peoples that is deep and rich and really amazing, and you don't know about it.
My wife is a teacher at a university in Abu Dhabi, and I don't know that there's enough in schools when it comes to studying the history of their own country.
This was something that my old pal Peter Hellier was trying to start to address. But I think you're also seeing a change now in the archaeology of here, because that process we discussed, I was moaning that archaeologists would come here, dig, and take the knowledge back to their universities, and the paper was published in Bremen and not in the Emirates. And that's changing now. You're now starting to see archaeologists who are resident here, people like Tim Power, who's excavating Sinai Island in Al Quwain. Quite a few of them in Abu Dhabi, actually. But you're now starting to see this new generation of archaeologists who are not only staying to do archaeology here, but who are lecturing in universities here. And now you start to have that practical application of archaeology as a skill brought to students in universities, and that knowledge staying here and being given to students in universities.
Right. So when you go back home, and you're talking to friends, relatives, and you discuss the history of the UAE, and you get the eye roll because they'll say, "Oh, it's only since 1971." Are there one or two stories that you tell them and they go, "Oh, I didn't know that," and maybe their perception changes a little bit?
I mean, for me, the big one, the starter, is the fact that the Arabian Gulf used to be a valley. Mankind walked out of Africa to populate Earth, and did so, humankind, out of Africa to populate Earth, over the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. At the time, because of glaciation, the world's water was tied up in the glaciers. So the world water levels were 100 meters lower than they are today. Now, the Gulf's 100 meters deep at its deepest. So in fact, what you had around about 6,500 years ago, 6,500 BC, so 8,000 years ago, was the Gulf was a valley. So humankind emerged from Africa to populate the Earth. If you go to the Malaya Archaeological Center, you'll find the find site of Fire 1, which shows that 125,000 years ago, humankind stopped in Sharjah on its way to populating the eastern side of the world. And then they stayed in that rich, verdant valley, which was nourished by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, huge lakes, which would have been surrounded by wildlife, and they were hunter-gatherers, so they would have hunted and gathered down there. And then all of a sudden, the world's weather changed, the glaciers melted, and the world's water levels went up, and the Arabian Gulf flooded. And so around about 6,500 BC, so about 8,000 years ago, you start to see the emergence of all these villages and societies and grave sites, burials, all around the Arabian Gulf. Pop, 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 pop. This amazing emergence suddenly of communities where archaeologically the previous period had been barren, and almost 100% barren. So we know that humankind lived in that valley and then emerged. And of course, part of the emerging communities were the Sumerians, and they invented writing. And the Sumerian creation myth is the myth of Enki and Ninhursag. And Enki, the lord of sweet waters, creates Ninhursag from his rib. And of course, they're flooded, but they belonged in Eden. They lived in a place that was pure and virtuous and filled with love. And a fox convinced them to abrogate the deal and leave Eden. And you start to hear these things, and you realize that the Sumerian creation myth was appropriated in turn, that this became the creation myth that's behind all of the Abrahamic faiths. That was in the Arabian Gulf, which didn't used to be a sea. That's for starters. Now we start to get wacky. So you can start to see that the history of here is not just, in 1971 we founded a nation, and it wasn't, before 1971 there were some Bedouins, and then the British came and blew everybody up, which they did. But there's an incredible depth that goes right the way back to prehistory. The Nar civilization, the Hafid culture, the Wadi Suk culture, and then the three Iron Ages, and then the early pre-Islamic and the Hellenistic era. There's a huge amount there that nobody knows about.
Okay, so that brings up a great point, which is then why does the GCC not get the historical nod for importance that maybe other parts of the Middle East get?
Because it's a neologism. Because when I say we, Europe had made up its mind that history was written in a certain way. Leonard Woolley did archaeology with Lawrence of Arabia in Karshemish, in Ur of the Chaldees. We'd investigated the pyramids. We'd looked at the Iranians. Influenced by the Victorians, we were on the search for empires. We respected empires, the Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. We understood empires. And that empirical lens meant that we looked at the Middle East, we missed whole lumps of it. The first archaeology ever done in the Emirates was in 1959. It was thanks to a couple of Danes, actually, a bloke called P.V. Glob and his mate Geoffrey Bibby.
You have the best names.
It wasn't me, it was the Danes in the yeah, but Glob and Bibby decided to go to Bahrain and excavate tumuli there. And they started, and they found the remains of Sumerian Dilmun. And at the time did a big feature about all the gold they'd unearthed. And Sheikh Shakbut of Abu Dhabi was convinced that he could play host to these guys and they might find some gold in his territory as well. And he quite liked the sound of that idea. And so they were invited over to come and excavate in Abu Dhabi. And they actually were digging in Nar. The island the place is called Nar, which gave its name to the civilization they found. And while they were there, Sheikh Zayed rocked along with his brother Hazza. And Zayed said, you people, you're interested in humps. And Bibi and Glob said, oh yes, Sheikh Zayed, we're really interested in humps. And Zayed said, I've got hundreds of these in our lane. And they're like, no, Sheikh Zayed, no, that's not possible. No, really, I do. Okay, Sheikh Zayed, well, whatever you say. And then 3 days later, they get an invitation to go to Al Ain to meet with Sheikh Zayed. And literally, he shows them a sea of hundreds of tumuli. And Glob said, there lie the men who died in the age of ignorance. And that actually turned out to be the find site for the Hafid culture, which is a great Bronze Age culture, which saw the invention of copper and the start of the copper trade with Sumeria, which was so characteristic of the Emirates. The Emirates became the world's first intercontinental trading network between Sumeria, the Mesopotamians, and Harappa, which is the Indus Valley culture of Pakistan. Right in the middle of those two, the intermediary trading hub was what we now call the Emirates. It was a land they called Magan. And so the first intercontinental trading network on human record comes from here. And again, as I said, you start with the Garden of Eden, now you go through the world's first trading network. It keeps getting wacky.
So I want to get back to the book itself. So this one, Motivate, has published.
Yes.
Now you've done some self-publishing as well as traditional conventional publishing. Walk me through the pros and the cons of both.
So self-publishing, Amazon is like a Concorde. It flies at Mach 2. It's incredibly sophisticated. It is a machine. I always find conventional publishing is much more like a Massey Ferguson tractor. It's a passive industry. If you think about the way that you deal with bookshops, you walk into a bookshop, nobody bothers you, nobody hard sells you. You're given all the time in the world you want to wander around, and eventually you get to the till and the girl pulls her head out of her Jane Austen and rings up the transaction for you. And publishing tends to be like that all the way through. It's a very passive industry. Amazon, you can create a Kindle book and have it on sale anywhere in the world instantaneously at zero cost. Amazon will then turn that into a CreateSpace book, which means they use what's called POD machines, espresso machines, where literally you key the name of a book into one end of the machine and that book pops out of the other end. So Amazon custom prints every book you buy. So if you go to Amazon, you happen to have the particularly good taste to go to Amazon and buy my books. Each one you buy will be printed individually for you. Amazon has just launched a beta of their Audible AI-assisted audiobooks. So now you can have your book narrated by an AI voice, created instantaneously and made available to anywhere in the world at zero cost. So Amazon will print or create a Kindle book, a paperback book. You can print a hardback book, and now an Audible audiobook, all at zero cost, all virtually instantaneously for sale to anyone, anywhere in the world. It's a remarkable operation. The problem comes really in how far you're willing to go in promoting your books, because the trouble with selling books is people need to know the books are there.
But don't you also think, I'll stop you there for a moment, don't you also think that there's a poo-pooing aspect to self-publishing?
Oh yes, I've been poo-pooed.
One of my favorite expressions.
Yes.
And
you know what you do? You poo-poo their poo-poo.
I should, and we will, right here. So when that happens, how do you counter that? Why is it that, and I haven't done the research, but to my knowledge, the books that are traditionally the ones most successful, of course, are the ones that are published conventionally.
And there are a number of books that were self-published and then picked up by conventional publishers looking at the sales figures.
Yes.
So, for instance, The Martian, Andy Weir, was a self-published book that did well. I think 50 Shades of Grey was in a similar place.
But that maybe should have stayed as a self-publisher.
Most people agree, yes, very, very badly written.
But you can't argue with the sales.
You can't argue with the sales. But the trouble there, the secret sauce is, who knew that a really badly written book
would do so well?
Would do so well, and nobody did. And the problem you've then got is the publishing industry becomes this Me Too operation where vampires are selling, so sign up vampire books. And there are these great truths in conventional publishing. Poetry doesn't sell, the Middle East doesn't sell. People don't want to read about this or that. And they cleave to these truths until they become untrue. By that time, it's too late for the majority of the market. The one person that found out that change in consumer perceptions and who climbed on that bandwagon will do incredibly well. But the rest of the industry will then be playing catch up.
Right.
So it's not as if they inherently understand what it is that makes books sell. I don't think they do. And for me, the validation was in signing an agent. So that meant somebody thought you were commercially viable. The agent didn't manage to find a publisher, so I sacked him. That felt wonderful. And then I realized I don't need their validation. I want to get this book into people's hands. So my first book, Olives, I printed 2,000 copies locally here, put them in sale in local bookshops, sold out in the end, promoted it until my fingers were bleeding. And that's, I think you've got to have the ability to stick in there with the promotion. And even I found that wearing. And by the time I got to my third book, I just wasn't bothered anymore.
You bring up something that I find interesting that I had mentioned to you in a message the other day, where I said, as a Canadian, I know when it comes to songs and when it comes to books, Canadian authors and artists are often told, don't make the center of your story Canada. Make it in the US, because it'll be seen to be sexier, more attractive, and you'll be, of course, exposing yourself to a wider audience. And I think the same is true, and I think from the research that I've done about your early books, where publishers would have said to you, maybe don't base it in the GCC. You could probably base it in Beirut in the 50s.
Not even. So my first book was based in Jordan, contemporary Jordan. Beirut was based in contemporary Beirut, Shemlan, Beirut, and to a certain degree Syria. Publishing London wasn't interested in those. And that advice to Canadian writers, I think, is the most ridiculous cloth-eared rubbish, and it's so typical of conventional publishing. Oh, here's a great truth. Don't write about Canada. Don't write about what you know. Make it up and write about the US. It's just rubbish. And you will find somewhere there'll be a breakout Canadian author who will smash it, and then suddenly everyone wants Canadian books.
But do you think, though, that perception will change about the GCC? And maybe at some point there will be a comfort factor having a novel based in Dubai.
See, that's the one thing I'm not prepared to do, and I was never prepared to do, is write the Dubai book. Because you know what's going to run it, you know what's going to feed it, it'll make it popular with the British public, is a Daily Mail version of Dubai. There was actually a film optioned by begins with Pan. Who's the big studio that begins with Pan? It's gone. But there was a book optioned, screenplay optioned by a big film studio, and the global financial crisis meant that it was never made. Please God. And that book started with, he's square-jawed and tanned. He faces her across the tennis net. She looks like Jessica Rabbit. The camera pulls back to show them having their weekly game of tennis on the helipad of the Burj Al Arab. And this screenplay went downhill from there at hundreds of miles an hour. There was a Sikh crane driver that saved his marriage by delivering a Tiffany ring in time for her birthday. And just the most woeful, awful stuff. And they loved it. And that is not a book I'm prepared to write. Yeah,
I think in pop culture today, the only thing that really resonates when it comes to popularity of Dubai is probably the Mission Impossible movie, where Burj Khalifa was the star. And I think we can all accept, fine. That one we're okay with. And there have been a couple of books, nonfiction, that have been written about various aspects of life here. But I am waiting for that novel. And it'll be at some point, I would think, in the next 10 years or so, with all the journalists that have come through, who will pick the UAE, probably Dubai, as the core of that group, that story, because they know it'll sell. And I don't fault them for that, but I just hope that it has a little bit of gravitas rather than the Daily Mail aspect of it.
There is an old book called Dubai by an author called Robin Hitchcock, who wrote, I can't remember the film, but it was a smash hit film. And he wrote the book that film was made out of, and I just can't remember, it's escaped me now. Robin Hitchcock's Dubai is set in Dubai in the 1950s. It's about gold smuggling. That's rather fun.
Yeah, and I think that could be fun, but I don't think that's not what would sell today, though, right? They would want not Dubai before it was Dubai. They want Dubai now. Now, let me ask you this. You've been here for such a long time. One of my favorite expressions is the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not stealing it from a Clint Eastwood movie, but tell me about what you think, the good, the bad, and the ugly of having spent so many years, maybe overseas or maybe in the UAE.
I can't think of a bad. I've not been unamused for a single day in all of these years. There's been so much happening here. There's been so much to do. Life here has just been very, very rich. I think I don't want to sound like a motivational podcaster here, but it really is what you make of it. If you decide that you're enjoying yourself. And there's this sort of exponential curve I'm very fond of, that if you've done a year here, you're 50-50 likely to love it or hate it. If you've done 2 years, it's 75-50. You've done 33 years, you're pretty much in the Kool-Aid here. And yeah, I have drunk that Kool-Aid. But an environment to succeed in, an environment of opportunity, an environment which you can make anything you want, you can make a success of yourself, you can set out to do something new, chart uncharted pastures. You can do all of that here. I think that there's unlimited, unbridled opportunity here. And I think to a great degree that's always been true. I think it's become more obvious recently. And now you start to see innovators, scientists, researchers, startups, all of these ecosystems here, your unicorns. So I don't think there's any limit to what you can achieve here. And before somebody says, oh, what about the poor old labourers? Well, do you know, a lot of those people sent money home and sustained their families. Not a few of those people stayed here and made successes of themselves. And some of Dubai's richest, or the UAE's richest Indian and subcontinental millionaires, multimillionaires and billionaires came here with nothing. You can start from nothing here, and you can restart here as well.
This is one of the issues that I've had for many years. The problem with the Western media's take on the UAE, the Gulf in general, but specifically Dubai, is this inability to have a nuanced conversation about the good and the bad and the ugly. We've been here long enough, we know some of those issues. But just as you said, that there are, and I used to say this to my children when they were growing up here, is that, we've all come here to try to do something a little bit different or maybe a little bit better. And that could be making more money, or it could be just being exposed to something that's a little bit different. And I know that there have been instances where so many of these men have been taken advantage of and they've been messed over badly. But, Dubai in particular is, a capitalist society. So when there are faults, my accusation is always leveled at the Western journalists. Why does that become the problem exclusively of the government? Why is that not the problem of that private company and the way that they're operating? And I don't think that there is enough willingness on the part of the local community, I'll be quite specific with the Emiratis. They don't seem to want to have those conversations where they stand up and they explain/defend what it is that has gone on here for so long.
I think there's a certain sense that it really isn't worth the argument because you're not going to change anything.
But why not at least put your argument out there on the record?
I agree. And the Emirates generally doesn't tend to be as good at doing that as it might be. But then you've also got the problem of frames. There's this rather wonderful book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And it's about the creating frames. Of course, what's the first thing you thought of as an elephant? And frames are built out of linked themes and ideas. So, for instance, if I say stethoscope, gurney, doctor, nurse, you're thinking hospital. So you link those concepts very easily to a hospital. That's the container for them. And if I throw in blueback whale, then that would be very jarring because it doesn't belong in that context. And when you look at framing the Palestinian problem, if your response to that is to say, I'm not a problem, you just reinforce the frame. So if you take on all this criticism, what they call misperceptions, and you then say, look, this is a misperception, and you deal with it, all you've done is strengthen the misperception. And I think the decision was made formally, informally, that the Emirates should tell its own story and not be framed by somebody else's decision to portray it in a certain way.
And I think you're right. I think that's exactly the way that they handle it, where they, hence why there are so many newspapers in such a small country. And that brings up another interesting question that I have for you. Hopefully it's interesting. What's your take, because you've worked in the media for a long time, in and out, PR and or legacy media, the media today, your thoughts? Now maybe we get the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Febron. Yeah, it's a mess. You've got the combination of newspapers that didn't see their inevitable disintermediation. You've got the rush to social media and to influencers and content creation, which is still struggling with some of the very basic concepts of how you communicate with audiences, how you make money out of communicating with audiences. You've got huge changes in societal behaviors and expectations, long-form content versus TikTok, the attention span of the average 16 to 18-year-old. All of these things are causing huge challenges and have been for the last 10, 15 years. A lot of it we saw emerging back in 2007, 2008. And I remember having great arguments with journalists back then when I was prophesizing the death of conventional media. What's happened, though, is that death is taking place, and there's nothing obvious taking its place, replacing it. And yet we're now starting to see that there is value to legacy, conventional media, that we do need journalism. What we're now struggling with, I think, is how do we pay for that? How do we make it viable? And how do we get beyond the flight to branded content, which I don't think is actually a long-term solution? And to be honest with you, I mean, if I did have all the answers, I'd be running my media empire.
Yeah.
But I think it's a time of great confusion and a time of great scatter. I think there are huge opportunities out there for the right people, but it's really piecing it together. What I thought would happen, like the dominance of platforms like Facebook, that hasn't really happened in the way I thought it would originally, because we're seeing Meta really emerging as the only player standing now. Musk has completely killed Twitter.
So yes, but Twitter is popular for a certain segment of the population that goes to Twitter specifically because they want to see, that dumpster fire, right? But I do think that in the local scene, and I just had Richard Fitzgerald on an episode recently, who is, the founder of Augustus Media, which is Love in Dubai. Now, he's doing something that is incredibly successful financially. And there's also, and he and I spoke about this, there's also a love-hate relationship with Love in Dubai. All you have to do is look at the comments.
Yep.
And yet it is popular, for good or for bad. Maybe like the Daily Mail, but it has its pros and its cons. But for the stuff that we're talking about today, Children of the Seven Sands as an example, and the history of the country, and the good stories that need to be told, Love in Dubai, for all it does well, is not going to produce a 600-word article about an interesting teacher who's lived an amazing life for 30 years in Iraq. That's just not going to happen. And I think that's where legacy media comes in. But you bring up a fantastic point, which is, but how do we make money from that? Yeah. How do we pay the journalists? And
the problem you've got is the environment right now. It's clicks makes the money, and what makes clicks, and It's a glorious mess makes clicks, and a nuanced 1,200-word piece about a teacher in Iraq is not going to get you the clicks. So then you have to find a model that gets you the traffic and the clicks, but also lets you slip in some of that more considered stuff. There are platforms like Medium which could support these more nuanced versions of media. I don't think we've kind of emerged yet into clear light. I think we're still muddling about in the dark.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Daily Mail model is the world's 8th largest news website. I mean, I find that profoundly depressing.
All right. So 10 years from now, where do you see the UAE? What will be its priorities when we're in the year 2035?
It's going global. More of the same, I think. I think we're going to see more expansion. I think we're going to see more innovation. I think we're going to see more value creation here. We've seen it emerge. This used to be a re-export hub. You know, you bring in loads, you break them down, you send them to regional markets, you bring in regional goods, you break them up and you send them to global markets. It increasingly now is a global market for IP. If you look at DP World, they import talent and then sell that talent under management contracts to ports around the world. You look at Donata. Donata is managing airport operations all around the world using talent that they've imported into the Emirates. Jumeirah. Now, Jumeirah has a hospitality school, and so Jumeirah is bringing in talent and educating talent, creating new talent, and exporting that talent. So I think we're going to see more of that, and I think you're going to see the Emirates' role as a hub continue, not just logistics, but also as a human hub, a global human hub. I am enormously optimistic about the place.
Wonderful.
Well, it's been all the years, you see, so it's the Kool-Aid.
Alexander McNabb, thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Thank you, sir.